um, very interesting for the discipline of international relations. Let me begin by telling you what this lecture is about. The lecture is about the story of globalizing India. It is a story about globalizing India, which is riding on neoliberal reforms, which in many ways provided the immediate context for the transformative relationship between the state and the market. It also is about the angst and the voices of people witnessed in a kaleidoscope of protest, resistance and contestation to the forces and institutions of globalization. What I would not do in this lecture is I would not chronicle the whole range of social movements, but I would analyze the broad patterns and typology of protest, which are particularly attended to neoliberal globalization, and historicize how that gets framed by different articulations of national imagination. So in a very, very fundamental way, the lecture is about exploring the interface between the role and place of national economy as an integral to national imagination of a country in post-colonial societies like India, which is embedded in and as it informed by the social cultural modalities. In other words, the lecture explores the cognitive cosmos of national imagination, wherein global economy provides the context for the interlocking and overlapping interface between the global and the local spaces, wherein the global provides a ready fodder for national symbolism and articulations, and also lays the terrain for contestation, often expressed through the agency of social movements. Let me at the beginning outline the scope of the lecture. As you can see, it is organized around broad 7 sub-themes, and I will be discussing that as I go along through this lecture during this evening. So the first, so it's basically, as you can see, it's about looking at social movements and discourse, and I take social movements and discourse given the range of communicative and reflexive action embedded in the social movements. It also looks into the debate between the overlapping boundaries between the social and political, to what extent they overlap, to what extent they are separate. Then I want to look at some of the theoretical explanations as to why social movements occur. And then I come to what I have as a central sort of question to this lecture, which is looking at global economy and national imagination. I look at the theoretical literature on this particular aspect, looking at the analytical frame. I look at how national economy was viewed in the case of India, and how, again, this is to historicize the context of the social movements in India. Then I move on to neoliberal globalization and national reimagination, and then I look at typology of protest and conclusions. So to begin with, as I said, this paper looks at social movements as a medium for expanding the boundaries of the discourse, which is described as the constitutive factor of social relations, or what Foucault describes as regimes of truth that defines the boundaries of common sense or worldviews at a given historical juncture. So while discourse defines the boundaries of social actions and worldview, social movements as a form of reflexive and communication action plays a critical role in influencing the boundaries of what is generally conceivable, either by promoting thinking that is not established in the mainstream discourse, or even antagonistic to it, or by creating new issues and concepts through their practices. In many ways, therefore, social movements are not seen as an expression of political opposition, but rather as a decisive force that molds that opposition. A variety of communication practices, including protests, symbols, slogans, pamphlets, newspaper articles, press releases and statements, news media, books, use of social media increasingly now by social movements, are therefore seen as not only instrumental strategy for mobilization, but also as an important medium for expression of the identity of social movements. While looking at the social movements, it is important also to remember that social movements are plural, with multitude of identities leading to a space for openness and ambiguity, that social identities can never be totally fixed, and they're always contingent and precariously linked. As a result, the articulations within the movements can have various subject positions, some of which are articulated, but some of which can change and transform over a period of time, not only because of plurality of identities within social movements, but also in their engagement with the state, other agencies, and the attendant political process, and thus contributing to alternative discourse. It is also important to remember the reciprocity between discourse and its materiality, which means that the institutions and processes of state provide an important context for social movements' maneuverability to redefine the boundaries of the existing discourse. Then I move on to a very interesting set of and vibrant set of debate on looking at the boundaries of the social and the political. Now, there are some scholars who argue most social movements do not seek state power, but autonomy from its state itself, and instead generates social power, which in turn changes or modifies political power. And these are the definitions which I guess most of you have perhaps also seen in some of the earlier lectures. I'm not going to therefore repeat them, but just to sort of underline in what sense, and that is where I guess it's important to remember that social movements is the mobilization of collective action, which is defined by specific solidarity, engaged in a conflict with an adversary for appropriation and control of resources valued by both of them. Charles Tilly goes on to argue that social movements have particularly three constituting elements: campaigns of collective claims on target authorities, an array of claim-making performance, including special purpose associations, public meetings, media statements and demonstration, and that is where, again, as I said in the beginning, about the role of communication is very important. And the third is public representation of the causes, worthiness, unity, members, and commitment. Now, therefore, even though social movements do not claim for political power, they offer avenues for political transformation. It is also argued by scholars such as Tilly that despite distinct terminology of the social and the political, social movements have political orientations which by the turn of the century became vehicle of popular politics throughout the democratic or democratizing world. These are seen as politics of masses, expression of popular sovereignty, and hence are crucial sides to understand the logic and legitimacy of the polity, and also which are closely associated with the democratic process. Tilly therefore goes on to say that social movement is neither a party nor a union, but a political campaign. What we call a social movement actually consists of a series of demands or challenges to power holders in the name of a social category that lacks an established political position. Hence, participation in social movements may not always necessarily be in the quest for identity. Rather, it may be for the gratification of political or material interest. In many ways, therefore, it is important to remember that social movements are seen to be contributing to the democratic political process, and you have a whole range of scholars who look at social movements as contributing to the democratizing political space. The slide that you're seeing around is the statement by Kothari, who looks at social movements as attempts to open alternative political spaces outside the usual arena of party and government, though not outside the state. So in a way, they are new forms of democratizing mechanism, which Sheth defines as micro movements. Now, Having said that, it is also important to remember that social movements are sites which are mediated by power, not only because often the boundaries between social movements and political process are overlapping, but because social movements are political in orientation and in many cases compete for the same political space, in particular with political parties. This is especially important in India, where boundaries between social and political is highly porous. Here, the social movements are highly politicized and are penetrated by political parties, just as movement seeks occasional policy intervention through the exigencies of political parties and the state to articulate and translate their demands. Many of the leaders forming their own political parties or joining any political party, thus the boundaries between the two remain rather ambiguous. I want to now focus on, again, as I said, some of the theoretical literature on why social movements occur in the first place. And there are varieties of explanations given by scholars on the emergence of social movements. The first explanation which is given is that social movements occur during periods of excessive social disorganizations or rapid social economic change. It can be industrialization, it can be urbanization, it can be mass migration, and so on and so forth. Now, periods of economic crisis in particular increase disappointment and frustration of people with the economy itself, as they do not satisfy people's needs for community, identity, spirituality, or often even material welfare. The other explanation for the emergence of social movements is attributed to what is known as the cyclic dimension to the emergence and the demise of social movements, which is linked to long political or economic or ideological cycles. So therefore, when the conditions that give rise to movements change through the actions of movement themselves, or more usually due to the changing circumstances, the movements tend to disappear. So this cyclic theory therefore suggests that periods of economic downturn shapes and influences social movements, if not directly, but by creating political opportunity structure, thus amplifying movements' demands, mobilization, and network and alliance formation. That brings us to the third important explanation of what is known as political opportunity structure, which Sidney Tarrow is very closely associated with, who explains the rise of social movements to specific opportunities which include institutional access, shifts in domestic political alignments, conflict amongst elites, and the availability of allies. Linked to the opportunity structure, there is another sort of explanation about what is known as the mobilizing structure that is important to explain why social movements emerge in the first place. And here, the role of elites is important or underlined. What is also underlined is the informal networks such as kinship, friendship, and community networks in fostering social movements. Here, ideas and symbols are seen to be providing an important linkages in what is known as framing around issues of identities, symbols, and strategy, thus contributing significantly to the emergence of social movements. The final reasons for the emergence of social movement, which is very, very important, especially in the cases of democratic polities like India, whereby what is it in the democratic political process which witnessed whole range of articulations anchored around the agency of social movements. And some of the explanation to some extent bear on the lack of the institutional structure for demand articulation, equitable participation, representation, not to mention the absence of institutional structures for translating demands into actual policy frames. And as a result, citizens' faith in electric government recedes, and hence different forms of political articulations are attempted at. I will quote a very interesting statement by Susan Strange, who argues, politicians everywhere talk as though they have the answers to economic and social problems, as if they are really in charge of the country's destiny. People no longer believe them. The political participation in democracy thus often takes the route of protest rather than merely changing government through voting. In many ways, therefore, while these social movements or protests or different kinds of resistance are expressions of challenges to the legitimacy of the political process, they also underline a deep-seated tension in the polity in the immediate term. People like Kothari and others argue that in the long run, they contribute to the democratization of polity by bringing hitherto non-issues into the mainstream, such as human rights, environments, women issues, and so on and so forth. Let me move now to my central argument after giving you a broad outline about the social movements as to why, especially when you are looking at, as I said right at the beginning, we are looking at the story of India, which is riding on neoliberal reforms during the phase of what we know as globalizing India, which is clearly a process and not a moment of arrival. Now, the first thing which is important, and there is a body of scholarship which to some extent looks at economy as an important cognitive frame to construct the idea of a nation which is embedded in cultural modes. There are three different ways, as Crane says, in which global economy or national narratives around economy are invoked. The first is that narratives about economic sufferings, which creates a powerful realm of creation of collective identity. The second way in which economy is invoked as part of national imagination is economic accomplishment that can serve as emblem of shared glory. And the third is assertion of an organic society unity rooted in common economic life. In one sense, there is a close interplay between culture and economy. And as the statement says very, very clearly, and I want to emphasize here, is economy, it is economy that displays in the most striking way the domination of the imagery at all levels. Now, such an imagery about national economy creates worldview about wealth and power, and has a corresponding impact on structuring state-market relationships, setting the directions of economic policies, which means that economy cannot be completely de-embedded from the society and is in fact informed and structured by society and culture. The link between material and ideational becomes even more pertinent when external situation or global economy is seen to be inflicting damaging or restraining the economic life of a nation or its growth trajectory. Therefore, when narratives of victimhood or historical wrong gets pronounced in the national imagination, protectionism, economic nationalism, arguments for self-sufficiency are marshaled as tools of the other or from the onslaught of the global. This takes me to the historical construction of the national imagination on India. And this is just a very brief recap about how the idea of national economy was constructed in India. And again, I will come to what is the focus of my lecture is about how that gets contested over a period of time. So if you look at contemporary India, national imaginations about the economy and the corresponding state-market relations developed around the context provided by the British rule in India. Deshpande argues an important aspect of the specificity of Indian nationalism is the crucial role played by discursively constructed notion of national economy. Economic plight under the imperial rule also provided cardinal rationale for the demand for freedom from the British colonial rule. And you have constant references to the plunder of India manifesting themselves in what we all know as drain of wealth theories by Dadabhai Naoroji and others, and also expositions by Jawaharlal Nehru, who laid some of the problems and the associated poverty as a result of the British colonial rule. And again, the statement that is there in front of you is self-explanatory. According to Nehru, this is Nehru in Discovery of India, nearly all our problems today have grown up during British rule and as a direct result of British policy. We seem to be in the grip of some all-powerful monster. The peasantry was servile and fear-ridden. The industrial workers were no better, and this process had eaten its way deep into the body and soul of India, poisoning every aspect of our lives. In one sense, therefore, victimhood narratives also hark back to the past glory of India, to note that ancient India exhibited her vitality and genius in a variety of ways. The phrase golden bird was used to refer to India, to show the plentiful and abound richness which was systematically impoverished by the colonial rule, thus plucked bare the bird of gold and denied its rightful place in the comity of nation. That's the second part of the same explanation, or developing that argument further. Therefore, economic realm provided the ready fodder for national imagination. And again, to go back to Deshpande, who says, it is not just the print commodities, but other commodities which were important, such as hand-woven cloth or common salt, who Mahatma Gandhi used as important symbol for Swadeshi, to not only awaken the nation, but to take on the might of the British Empire. Reclaiming the economic destiny of the nation after independence was consistent with earlier nationalist protests against the colonial exploitation. The independent Indian state therefore became a symbol of the fulfillment of a new nation. It also became the epitome of a wide array of expectations, leading to an exalted state in letter and spirit. The aim was ambitious: to get rid of poverty, disease, inequality, and ensure adequate standards of living, and to wipe every tear from every eye. As expected, the new Indian state, and we all know it's a new Indian state guarded its autonomy and asserted self-sufficiency against the external forces, here in this case global economy. The policy of economic self-reliance and Swadeshi, which was imperative during the national movement, became a part and parcel of post-colonial Indian state psyche and the model of development that independent India adopted. This was also imperative on account of the fact that as late industrializer, India needed more centralized state structures, not only to protect the domestic industry, but to also embark on a massive state-led developmental project. The result, as we all know, was Nehruvian socialism, planned model of growth, which was to herald the march of a nation to its destiny. In such imagination, no conflict was seen between the nation and economic goal. The service of India meant the service of the millions who suffer. It meant ending of poverty and ignorance, and disease, inequality of opportunities. During the early years of independence, there was a widespread consensus on the ideological premise of the centrality of the state-led social and economic developmental model, which was cemented by what Kothari calls as the Congress system, denoting the near domination of Congress party by default of Nehru. This meant that in the domain of national economy, the role of market was seen as subservient to the state. So what changed that over a period of time? The fracture in national polity began to show by the middle of 1960s, a trend which became more pronounced after the death of Nehru in 1966 and the disintegration of the Congress system, heralding high incidences of social unrest and a variety of social movements. So the decade of the 60s or the mid-60s therefore saw a whole range of social movements, from peasant movements to tribal movements, Dalit, backward class movements, movements for issues of women, labor, students movement, middle class movements, human rights, environmental movements, and very, very important anti-big dam movements. In many ways, therefore, these social movements articulated a vision which was either at odds with the national imagination or contested the nationalist vision vigorously. For peasant movements, environmental or the movements for women's rights and movement for social justice, much of collective action was targeted against the homogenizing frames of development, often, as I said, often at variance with the national imaginations, many of which were anchored around environmental issues, and this is where I want to bring in opposition to Big Dam. Now, dams were seen as temples of modern India by Nehru as a part of the nationalist narratives on modernization, scientific temper, and rationalist model of development. And if you can read the statement which he gave at the time of his visit to the Bhakra Dam in 1954, and he says, I quote, "As I walk around the dam site, I thought that these days the biggest temples and mosque is the place where man works for the good of mankind. Where can be a greater, holier place than this, which we can regard as higher?" This vision and articulation of the national was openly contested by social movements, witnessed in numerous instances of opposition to Big Dam, of which Narmada clearly is the biggest and perhaps the longest, but also in different parts of India, Tehri Dam in Uttar Pradesh, Gumti Dam in Tripura, and Silent Valley projects and so on and so forth. And this is the statement with which some of you may be familiar with, just to contrast how the vision about Big Dam is completely contrasted by some of the activists involved with the Narmada Bachao Andolan. Big dams are seen as weapons of mass destruction, just akin to nuclear bomb, weapons that government use to control their own people. They are both malignant indicators of civilization turning upon itself. They scramble the intelligence that connects egg to hen, milk to cows, food to forests, water to rivers, air to life, and the earth to human existence. And then you have a whole range of environmental movements, right from Chipko to Apico and many others, who are to some extent looks at commodification of forest and developmental infrastructure against rapid deforestation and so on and so forth. About the espoused goals pursued by collective action through the social movement, an overarching idiom hinges around the issue of redistribution, encompassing equity, justice, or recognition, encompassing identity issues or the lack of it in independent India. This is also echoed, therefore, in multiple imaginations about economy, reflected in varied articulations about the relative hierarchy between the state and the market, and the place of global economy therein as brought forth by numerous protests against neoliberal globalization. This is where we have what we know over a period of time, a gradual emergence of consensus over both the desirability of neoliberal reforms attendant to the process of globalization. So during the 90s, the structural transformation in Indian economy was inaugurated by the Congress government. This meant drastic reframing and recasting of some of the earlier imagination. As India moved from the Nehruvian state-led planned economic model to a market-oriented economy attended to globalization, it meant not only rewriting some of the cardinal principles of national imagination erected during the period of independence and after, but also a fundamental transformation of the state-market relationship. Thus, in the 90s, the high modernist view of planned state-led development was replaced by accelerated periods of liberalization and reforms in India. Thus, Whereas the national economy was understood in the 19th century as the material base for the spiritual pursuit of the nation, the same national economy in the 21st century implies something different. The primacy of a national from a regulation in support of what Cameron and Palin talks as capital accumulation. The result in the Indian case was the rise of the market-friendly state, even as it retreated from some of its core obligation. The exalted Indian state, which failed to deliver during the previous decades under the planned economy, carried on the burden of expectations even in the age of economic reforms, even though under the impetus of neoliberal market orthodoxy, it no longer claimed its goal to wipe every tear from every eye, but was instead geared towards creating a favorable business environment. Contrary to commanding the market, the state became the central anchor to welcome the market and began to act as a catalyst and facilitator for global investments. For the federal polity, it created new have-nots, states which received foreign direct investments and states which did not. It therefore further fragmented the national imaginations as different states in the Union became competitors for not only seeking the largesses of the Indian state, but also as competitor for FDI as they vied with each other to provide an attractive business environment. At the same time, FDI, and I'll come to that in just about a minute, FDI has become one of the most divisive and politicized issues in Indian politics in recent times. Therefore, as Indian state began its retreat from its redistributive and welfare obligations, relegating those functions more and more to the market, opposition to these policies came from, of course, the grassroots movements, but also from the opposition party, a trend which subsequently converged towards a broad-based support for reform process, particularly for both BJP and the Congress, with perhaps the exception of the left. And these are the two sort of articulations by both BJP and Congress on their approach towards globalization. As you can see, they are all geared towards what we know as pro-reforms. So therefore, for example, the BJP's manifesto says, the BJP views that, again, referring to the big shift taking place in the global economy, India should be prepared to take advantage of it, right? And then he goes on to say that India must generally enhance her economic strength in order to enhance her national interest and become a great power. The manifesto of the Congress party likewise talks about similar issues. The transition to new liberalism was based on new economic imagery that tried to produce a different kind of economic individual. As India emerged as a significant economic actors, leaders of the expanding Indian business such as Ambani's, Mittal's, Murthy's, Narayan Murthy, Ajit Premji, Ratan Tata, Lakshmi Mittal, even though he is an expat Indian, to name a few, were seen to be not only a symbol of the aspirations of a nation, but also contributing significantly to India's destiny as a great power. Mittal, after his takeover of the Arcelor steel plant, became the global face of Indian enterprise. Since then, a whole range of Indian companies have followed suit in various parts of the world, a reflection of what then Indian Trade and Industry Minister Kamal Nath noted. It is symbolic of the new economic architecture, where countries that have had a different mindset will now have to accept that India is going to be a major player in the new global architecture. As more and more Indian companies went in for mergers and acquisitions overseas, India's march towards destiny seems to be on a roll. The contradictory trend, or the sort of contestation, came from the ground, which pointed to a shrinking of political space for the poor and the marginalized. Liberalization also made the gulf between the rich and the poor more pronounced, aggravated by unemployment and high rate of inflation. Thus, there was, and I will quote, an astounding colonial type exploitation of primary producer, the vast population of tribals, artisans, small and marginal farmers and landless laborers by a small urban industrial elite and their cognitive groups. So of upper caste rural elite was seen to persist, even thrive in the so-called open economy. Political outcome, as I said, were the vigorous contestation of national imagination, which was being constructed around the homogeneous global frames, the inevitability of neoliberal reforms that was rooted in both material and the cultural domain. The global gradually became a part of the domestic political process, drawing strong reactions from a variety of social movements, some of which, though not all, were closely aligned to political parties in opposition. This brings me to the sixth part of my lecture, which is looking at the typology of protest attendant to what we know as globalizing India. Within the broad matrix of social movements against hegemonic neoliberal globalization, three types of social movements can be identified on the basis of their respective articulation on two central issues: recognition and redistribution. And when I say recognition and distribution, I would also say that the boundaries between these two issues often overlap as a result of the interface between political process and social movements. The first type of these movements against mainframe globalization are centered on what we know as the questions of redistribution, which primarily hinges around questions of equity, of exploitations, of delivery of justice. And as you can see, a lot of these are targeted against what we know as the institutions of globalization, so symbols of globalization, which is WTO, IMF, World Bank. The one at the bottom is about the free trade agreement. And you have whole range of mobilizations actually have emerged around exploitations of groundwater resources by big companies, pesticide water contamination, genetically modified food and biotechnology. The picture on the extreme right with that brinjal others is basically go back Monsanto, just as in the middle you are talking about Coca-Cola quit India, and as I said, whole range of issues, environmental and otherwise, linked to the exploitation of social of resources by the MNCs. The other aligned issue is, as I said in the earlier part, is the issue of SEZs, and FDI in retail becomes very, very important. And you have series of local protests against SEZs in different parts of India. Some of the prominent one, of course, you are quite familiar with, but let me just mention one or two. Reliance SEZs in Maharashtra, Dadri in Uttar Pradesh, and of course, very, very importantly, the Tata Motor plant in Singur in West Bengal. What is important to the SEZ protest is that, and that is where I say the issue of redistribution is important, because what was very, very important in these articulations was the issue of displacement of people, regional imbalances and other equity issues, which were important sets of demands which were articulated by these social movements or protests of different kinds. Aligned concerns that dominated the political agenda around SEZs are the charges of corruption in granting permission for projects and allocations of land fraud for SEZs. The second type of protest finds expression primarily in the cultural milieu and derives its strength from harping on the Indian values, which are seen to be under threat due to the onslaught of westernization and modernization. These can be termed as variety of Swadeshis, as they include a multiple articulation which largely centers around recognition or identity questions. These largely include right-wing political affiliations, again symbols of Western values, Westernization such as McDonald's because it sells beef, Miss World pageant, protest against Valentine's Day, which are seen as an affront to Indian cultures and tradition. Miss World pageant because it commodifies women, and Indian women are supposed to be the repository of cultural tradition of India as a nation. So in that sense, the Swadeshi here were national as part of their collective imaginations need to be preserved from the global forces and purified of contamination. The third type of social movement is of hybrid variety, and I would say majority of the social movements to some extent combine both recognition and redistribution argument, both economic as well as cultural expressions at the same time. These social movements are often rooted in the realm of identity and culture or invoke identity and culture, and they are often fused with livelihood questions to become an important political weapon, especially for the purpose of mobilization of resources. You have, for example, part of these is, of course, opposition to Big Dam, and Narmada always use a very combination of identity as well as equity questions. You also have these questions very, very closely intertwined in a variety of environmental movements and indigenous peoples' movement. So in one sense, globalization becomes to some extent a pivot to link various issues, further reinforcing the global and the local interface, especially since reforms was seen to be integral to the process of globalization. The slide that you see now actually is, to some extent, speaks about different visions within the mainstream political parties, affiliations, and also social movements as to how they look at social movements. Within, for example, the right wings, you have traditionalist and you have the modernist. And traditionalist, as you can see, you have the Swadeshi Jagran Manch, the same people who are opposed to the McDonald's, opening of McDonald's restaurants in Vaishno Devi and in Amritsar, even though it's primarily going to be a vegetarian restaurant, because they feel, I mean, these are the companies which basically, you know, they basically spite Hindus, and they continue to sell beef in different parts of the world. The second sort of ramification, and this is looking at more as to what the process of globalization has brought to the political process. As far as the political process is concerned, at the local level, network and coalition building among social movements is very, very notable during this period, as new technologies offered possibilities for greater mobilization of people. Examples include Jan Andolan Samanvay Samiti. It also includes National Fish Workers Forum against the opening of India's coastal areas to deep sea fishing by MNC trawlers in 1996, which finally led to the withdrawal of licenses granted to the MNCs. The network effect also leads to overlapping issues cutting across social movements. For example, Narmada Bachao Andolan, a movement against Big Dam in India, that clearly engaged in partnership with similar global movements against Big Dam, also involved itself with different kinds of farmers' protest, tribal rights, and protest against SEZs in various parts of India. Also, a number of farmers' movements have taken up issues of women's rights. However, it is important to note that the gender sensitivity of the social movements is contingent on regional, economic, and cultural variations in different parts of India. For example, in Maharashtra, farmers' movements adopt a progressive stance towards women's equality as compared to those in UP that is more embedded in patriarchal frame. An interesting, I wouldn't say casualty, but to some extent a downside to globalization, especially when you're looking at social movements, has been the labor movements, which have received a setback not only within India but across the world during the periods of reforms and globalization. The changes in economy brought about by the expansion of services sector of ICT, retail and call center further fragmented and marginalized the labor movements as it became difficult for workers to have a cohesive agenda since demands and requirements across sectors varied widely. This also opened up possibilities of a much greater penetration of global frames and norms into the domestic discourse and building of transnational coalitions against neoliberal globalization, of which India chapter of World Social Forum and again various other networks, for example on issues of climate change and many others, are few examples. The positives also include rise of some independent industry-based trade unions in banking, in insurance and in finance sector, and also an increasing attention towards the informal sector of economy and the rights of workers employed therein. Such variations within and across social movements notwithstanding, the broadening of the agenda of social movements and clustering of demands among social movements through global and local networking is quite tangible. That brings me to the conclusion part of my talk. In the initial period of the construction of a nation, an ambitious Indian state under the Nehruvian model of development was able to consolidate the vision of the nation around the centrality and the desirability of economic development. This meant the state guarding against external economic forces or global, which made it imperative to have planned model of economic development that made markets subservient to the nation's march towards its destiny. Subsequently, however, as the state belied people's aspirations and expectations, the national imagination became open to contestation. A number of social movements, as I have pointed out earlier, making claims to the state on accounts of either lack of redistribution or recognition or both, fractured national imagination. The same pattern was repeated to some extent in the 90s when Indian state recast its imagination to deliver India its rightful place in the community of nations. The national discourse now sought to deliver it through the vehicle of economic reform, liberalization, and active engagement with the world economy. Such recasting of national imagination failed to create a totalizing vision, and thus it remained only a partial imagination as what was not shared by a vast section of the Indian population, which in a way also generated fear of the global manifesting themselves in a variety of protest movements across India. Left on its own, the process of neoliberal economic reforms created widespread gap in income inequality within India, benefiting only few while disadvantaging vast number of people and community. The discourse, and that is perhaps the contribution of social movement become very important, the discourse that while India was shining, Bharat was reeling under its glare, seems to have stuck and indicates limited scope and expanse of national imagination frame around the primacy of market or neoliberal reform. The mood of the nation as reflected through these various protest and resistance movements increasingly demanded an arbitrated approach against the excesses of market in a globalizing India, or to put it differently, against neoliberal reform. The imagination of the nation again was therefore through the agency of social movements, through the discursive space created by social movements, was being reworked in a settled but strident manner, a trend that is likely to go as the economy lags in years to come, further reinforcing the need to protect the nation from the onslaught of the global economic forces. Besides, given the immense politicization of the global, national imagination is fiercely contested. To the extent that global economy forms the fulcrum of national imagination, numerous social movements indicate the gulf between statist discourse and national imagination remains very, very wide in a globalizing India, which means there is a fundamental legitimacy crisis which is being faced by the agency of state as it delivers neoliberal reform. a strong rationale and a requirement of renegotiation of national imagination, which is not only inclusive but also equitable, and one in which the nation retains itself and does not submit itself to the global, therefore summarizes the discourse from social movements. Thank you for listening. The role of mass media, and I guess perhaps what you're referring to is channels like Times Now and others, which, to some extent, how sensationalizes some of these movements. See, if you are, as I said, if you are looking at the role of social movements, and if you're looking at social movements as something which are contributed in important ways to the making or the unmaking of the discourse, you cannot but not look at the role of media, right? And therefore, media becomes an important tool for social movements to basically communicate as a reflexive exercise about not only their message but also to change people's opinion in terms of discourse, right? To the extent about whether you look at about the sensationalization, I mean, it's sort of inherent, it's in the nature of the beast, right? So in that sense, I would say at the same time, I think, as I said, it's important to locate how media is being used by social movements to basically further some of their goals. To Abhipsu's question, about this whole sort of overlapping boundaries between the social and the political and between the civil society and the state. I would not really go on to say that civil society has been colonized by the state, so to speak, but I would say that it remains an autonomous space, just as social movements, many of those retain that autonomous space. At the same time, because, and this is particularly important, I guess, in democratic polities, they have a tendency to governmentalize. In the sense, they use some of the categories that the state uses to be able to make their voices heard. So I would therefore not sort of say that state and civil society to some extent, therefore the distinction between them remains, but at the same time, very, very, of course, important to remember that these are sides which are mediated by power. So therefore, there is clearly, in different ways, sort of power play, both in relation to the state, political parties, but also within them, in terms of networking, in terms of bureaucratization, role of leaders, and so on and so forth. The second question that you had, I think, related to, you said, the traditional functions of the state. Clearly there is a dilution for some of the functions with which what we know as the welfare state, because now they are increasingly getting into the realm of the market, right? Whether you look at health, whether you look at education, or you look at whole range of issues, right? So to that extent, but at the same time, state is now increasingly becoming facilitator for the entry of the global forces into the domain of the national or the national economy, right? So from that point of view, to the questions about globalization, you said globalization is advantageous, right? To the extent, again, I would clearly, there are possibilities, right? But it is also important to remember to what extent these possibilities are distributed equitably, right? To what extent export of Bollywood movies, for example, or in Indian cinema, for example, is able to elevate poverty for the vast sections of Indian people, right? So clearly, I think if you have that in mind, while having said that, yes, it is important to remember that globalization is not always disabling in that sense. It can also offer avenues, but when you say that, what are those avenues, to whom those avenues are coming for, is something that you need to remember to then make an assessment to what extent globalization is beneficial or not beneficial. Okay, maybe I'll club the last two together. I won't say, that the present social movements are self-centered. You know, I think I would reserve and yeah. And I think social movements, you're right in the sense that you say that social movements will always be there, right? Because some kinds of injustice would always be there. Even when you talk about, for example, world government, I mean, how do you ensure that that will be completely just, right? So in that sense, social movements to some extent are about realm of possibilities, right? Of human imaginations to constantly improve their lot through different kinds of articulation. You may agree with them, you may not agree with them, but I think they offer a very, very important sort of avenue to some of those human to the what I would say core human emancipatory spirit. Mashmi's question is very interesting because clearly you see what we know as the shrinking of democratic political space to some extent because the way both economy and polity are organized. The easiest language that the state seems to be using is the language of violence, or the language of force. And in that sense, to some extent, the neoliberal globalization has clearly been, I guess, an avenue for undermining, as I said, democratic space and then making states take recourse to very, very violent kind of action, which even in countries, democratic countries, was perhaps unheard of or unthinkable 20 years ago. But nevertheless, so it is, yes, it is sort of part of that that shrinking space of that. I do not know. I mean, just because you are benefiting in some ways because of globalization, do you cease to be critical of globalization, right? We might, and I did mention the networking, I did mention the whole range of possibilities that have opened up. But that also then makes you aware about the different sufferings across different parts of the world and your ability to then organize and then take those actions. So I think my answer to that questions about social movements and anti-globalization movements, of course, technology, communication facilitates them. So why are they, opposing? Because here we are talking about fundamental questions of life and death. We are talking about questions of justice, which is not just about communicating with each other through Facebook or networking. It is much more greater than that. Social movements, as I think those nest of questions that I had, social movements as popular politics, social movements and political movements, and I do not know. I mean, I wouldn't say, Telangana, Gorkhaland, I think, to what extent, would you classify them as social movements or political movements? That's a question, right? So therefore, and the important point that you raise is about, it is true that there are, and I would just like to point out why I am saying that there are overlapping boundaries. For example, if you look at again the case of India, which I had mentioned again, when I say the boundaries between the social and political in the case of India often oral, most of the students' union, for example, are affiliated to political parties. Most of the trade unions movements, most of the farmers' movements have their affiliation to political parties in that sense, right? So that is about the overlapping boundaries between the two. I would perhaps reserve a much greater analysis to whether you need to term Telangana and Gorkhaland as social movements or political movements. That's something that we need to see. About the role of NGOs, yes, in terms of, sort of creating awareness, creating the necessary, for example, pool for available sort of, information dissemination, they play an important role. But again, I would argue that I would also not attribute a greater sort of emancipatory fervor to NGOs, because again, these are realms, just as the realm of civil society, the realm of social movements and NGOs, you need to again look at them as to how that sort of gets informed by the political power and how power politics plays in that. So to the extent that NGOs contribute to the mobilization, yes, but to what extent they actually contribute to emancipation is something that you need to see in reference to each of these case studies that X person is interested in.
Thank you, ma'am. A brilliant lecture from you. My question is about the national imaginations, the term you have taken in your lecture. What it is and how you describe that national imagination, and you have given an example.
Even during the freedom movement was multiple, right? So I would not, what I'm looking at is how certain construction of the status discourse gets to some extent normalized around when you, for example, look at what should be the relative place of state in the market, or what should be the relative place of the national economy vis-a-vis, for example, the global economy, right? You, even at the time of independence, for example, you had some of the industrialists, for example, we all know about the famous Bombay Plan, right? Which was, you know, sort of very different from what Nehru had in mind, right? So you have, at any given point in time, there are variety of articulations. What I mean by national imagination is the dominant paradigm, which at least in the time of Nehru was, for right or wrong, was all pervasive for quite some time, right? So you had clearly sort of Indian nation, which was driven by a certain model of economic growth, which is planned model of economic growth, and so on and so forth, centralized economy and all the rest of it, right? So that is what I mean by thing. Even then, I would clearly say, and as I mentioned, that is where the historical context which I discussed, that clearly you had different articulations taking shape and manifesting greatly just after the demise of Nehru, because that is when the fracture in the Indian polity began to take much greater much greater role. Impact of global capital on the indigenous people, yes, and of course, you know, the Niamgiri hills that you mentioned, clearly the Vedanta example is one of, you know, classic case, because see, the hills from the point of view of capitalist accumulation are clearly resourced, right? For the tribal people, these are hills which are sacred spaces. So there is, to some extent, so when you look at the protest around opposition to Vedanta, for example, you have both articulation which are twin, which is what I had said, the third articulation of social movements, which is the question of recognition, and which is the question of redistribution, the tribal identity, as well as the issues of equity, of sharing of resources, with the indigenous people, and so on and so forth, which is embedded to that kind of an issue. So I would, you know, completely thanks for that question, because that clearly shows how everything is not measurable in tangible material terms, but there are certain other sort of, you know, cultural attributes, questions of, you know, identity and many others which are important.